Do you owe citizens an apology for being absent while their homes were burning? And do you regret cutting the fire department budget by millions of dollars, Madam Mayor? Have you nothing to say today? Have you absolutely nothing to say to the citizens today?
It's Wednesday, January 15th, 2025, and welcome back to Goodfellows, a Hoover Institution broadcast examining social, economic, political, and geopolitical concerns. I'm Bill Whalen. I'm a Hoover Distinguished Policy Fellow. I'll be your moderator today, and I come with both good news and bad news. The good news is that two-thirds of our happy triumvirate has rejoined us for this show, so please welcome back the historian Sir Niall Ferguson and former Presidential National Security Advisor, Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster. Gentlemen, good to see you. All right, gentlemen, let's get right to it. Let's talk about the change of power about to occur in Washington, D.C. The 46th President of the United States, Joe Biden, soon to give way to the 47th President of the United States, Donald Trump. It's not the first time that an American president will begin a second term, but what is unique about this is that Trump is beginning a second non-consecutive term for the only second time a president has done this. Neil, I turn to you with the big question for this show, and it's a two-part question. Number one, what is the difference for Trump between a second term versus a second first term? And building upon that, do we honestly believe that a 78-year-old leopard can change his spots? In other words, do we think that Trump is going to pursue the second term with more discipline and a little more efficiency and a little more effectiveness?
Well, there's some really fundamentally different dynamics, from 2017 and this year, and there's some things will be the same, right? So what has changed? Well, the world's a much more dangerous place, and Neil and I have been talking about this for quite some time. It's a dangerous place, I think, largely or probably, most importantly, because of the coalescing of this axis of aggressors. These are the two revanchist or revisionist powers on the Eurasian landmass of Russia and China, who have pulled into the fold the Iranians, the theocratic dictatorship in Tehran, and the only hereditary communist dictatorship in the world in North Korea. So it's a dangerous place, and it's dangerous because what we've talked about on this show quite a bit, mainly because that this axis of aggressors perceive weakness in the United States and across the free world. So the world's changed. It's more dangerous. There are a number of challenges, but hey, there are a lot of opportunities. Neil's written about this recently, and I think Donald Trump could make us tired of winning. He really could this time because of, I think, some profound weaknesses.
But has Trump really changed? And Neil, you've been to Mar-a-Lago and you've seen him in that environment. What is different this time?
Well, I mean, this is what I was getting to. Is that the team is different because Trump knows this team much better. When I went in there quite unexpectedly in February of 2017, Trump didn't really know me. He didn't really know Jim Mattis, who was the Secretary of Defense. He didn't know Rex Tillerson as Secretary of State. And so what that did is it made it quite easy for those who were coming into the administration to sort of develop and widen rifts between the president and members of his key team. And there were really three groups of people in that administration in 2017. There were those who were there to serve the elected president. There were those who came in. I'm thinking of, people like Steve Bannon, for example, who weren't there to serve Donald Trump. They were there to advance their own agenda. And then you had a group of people who saw Donald Trump as an emergency that had to be contained, right? This time, there are going to be far fewer people in the third group, but there's still quite a lot of people, in that second group. And I think there are people coming into the administration who reflect to a great extent what Donald Trump is consistent about, right? I mean, border security, burden sharing, reciprocity in trade, energy dominance, right? We know you know what you're going to get in those areas. But there are also people who come in who reflect the dissonance Donald Trump has, the opposing ideas he carries in his head. Peace through strength versus budget hawks. You have people who understand the importance of burden sharing through alliances and through forward positioning of capable U.S. forces, and those who see retrenchment as an unmitigated good. So you're gonna see I think the at war with ourselves dimension. It's still going to be there, so it won't be boring. Neil, what are your thoughts on this?
I agree with a lot of what you've said, HR. If one just kind of compares the two administrations 8 years ago and now, this feels like it will be more cohesive. He has done the job before, and that does make a difference. A central problem of Trump 1 was the instability of the chief of staff role. Susie Wiles is going to be in that role. She's come through the campaign with him and clearly has his confidence. And you can tell that there's already a tighter ship by the lack of leaking to the press. It's actually anybody's guess what's going to be in the inaugural address at this point. The discipline is much greater. I think if one looks down the list of names, and here the media doesn't really help because they focus only on the controversial picks. So we'll read way more about Pete Hegseth or RFK than we'll hear about Marco Rubio, about Scott Bessent, about Doug Burgum. I could go on.
Mike Waltz, who's fantastic.
Mike Waltz.
Yeah, right.
If you look at, let's talk about the national security team, because HR rightly raises the very deep foreign policy problems that the new administration confronts. They're a very different world from the world of 2017, because this is a world where the axis is formed and there are live wars going on in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, and a non-trivial risk of another one over Taiwan. But if you look at that combination of Rubio as Secretary of State, you've got Mike Waltz at the National Security Council. It's an impressive, I think it's an impressive lineup. Keith Kellogg has been sent as special envoy for Ukraine and Russia. He's played a very important role in the interregnum, can we call it that, between the two Trump terms at the America First think tank. So when I look at the whole thing, I look at all the people who've currently been nominated, I think it's actually a very different beast from Trump 1, which, as HR says, was a weird coalition between people who got him elected who hadn't really expected to win, then the Republican Party establishment who were deeply wary of what they were getting into, and then there were certain people who, as you say, saw themselves as there to kind of save the republic from this demagogue who'd got elected. This is going to be a very different story 8 years on. There'll be trouble along the way, because there always is. And it will be a second term, even if there has been a 4-year hiatus. And the second term has certain dynamics. It's very hard to have a better second term than your first term. Think only of Ronald Reagan's difficulties in his second term. Still, with all of that said, I'm feeling a little more comfortable about where we're headed, and I'm 100 times more comfortable than I would be if by some weird quirk of the electoral system, Kamala Harris had just been sworn in as president.
So I hate to spring breaking news on you, but Donald Trump literally seconds ago just posted on social media that a hostage deal has been reached and they will soon be released. HR, if there is indeed a hostage deal, if indeed all of the hostages are released, and that's one of the keys to be determining here, if it's just a partial release or an entire release, does that open the door for Joe Biden to do something on the way out with regards to Iran, to strike their nuclear program, strike their oil production? Would you advise him to do so?
Well, I think it has to be an option, on Iran's nuclear program, and I think it's inevitable that the Israelis will act if we don't act. I think what's really notable about this hostage deal, which I think has been, the top priority for the incoming Trump team, as well as for the Biden administration. What's notable about it is, in a period of time when we see this kind of vitriolic partisan discourse, the outgoing Biden administration worked very closely with the incoming Trump administration.
Mhm.
The other dynamic associated with this deal that I think people might miss is that it's really Trump's assurance to the Israelis, the fact that the Israelis have no doubt that Trump has their back, that probably allowed the Israelis to make the kinds of concessions that they've had to make for this deal to happen in terms of the release of Hamas terrorists that are probably going to be part of this deal, because they know that if they have to track and hunt them down later, that the United States will support the Israelis in that effort. So, I think that's one of the dynamics associated with this, as well as the Iranians knowing, hey, Trump understands the return address for all this. He knows it goes back to Tehran. And so to the degree to which the Iranians influence, this process, as well as the Qataris, who know that, Trump would like to have a good relationship with Qatar, but also he's quite skeptical of the duplicity of the Qataris in a number of occasions and in a number of areas. So I think all these dynamics about Trump's experience from before, has played into this in a very positive way.
I think it's very important to understand that Trump's goal is indeed peace through strength. He wants the wars to end in the Middle East and in Eastern Europe, and to avoid a conflict, a hot war with China. And he's got to work even before he is sworn in, it's clear that his envoy to the Middle East has been actively negotiating. I mean, no doubt the Biden administration will try to claim credit for this, but I don't think that they could have done it on their own because they've been trying for how many months to achieve this. And I don't think it's accidental that Steve Witkoff turns up and suddenly there's a deal. I also think we'll see something similar in the case of Ukraine. And notice, since the election, Trump has spent much more time talking to and even being with Volodymyr Zelensky than talking to Vladimir Putin. So what's interesting is that this presidency has started even before the official launch, the inauguration, and there already are signs that there will be significant changes in the world in 2025. I've drawn the analogy in a recent foreign affairs piece with the beginning of the Reagan presidency. And you'll both remember that within minutes of Ronald Reagan finishing his inaugural address, the hostages in Tehran were released. So there's a similar vibe shift going on here where you realize that the kind of unsuccessful one-term president is on the way out, a new sheriff's in town, and that new president has greater credibility. Even before he's sworn in, the geopolitical shift is happening, and of course that has to be good news. I of course don't want to overstate the case. As I understand it, a significant number of terrorists will be released by the Israelis on their side. That is my understanding of the nature of this deal, and that's not great. On the other hand, if it takes the situation in Gaza closer towards a resolution, then we will have to accept that is a step that is a step worth taking. And clearly, Prime Minister Netanyahu, as HR said, is willing to take that step and make that concession now that Trump is on his way to the White House. And previously, he just wasn't.
The other dynamic associated with this, Neil and Bill, is as these hostages are released, I fear that some of them are probably have already been killed, by the terrorists. The world's going to have to confront the brutality, the inhumanity, the barbarism of Hamas, and I think that this will shift, I think, the narrative once again in favor of Israel and against these terrorists who really are the enemies of all humanity. And I think what that's going to do is inject new life into the Abraham Accords, to resurrect the Abraham Accords, and I think for Trump to really kind of stack up the number of diplomatic wins in the Middle East quite quickly, especially as Neil noted, his special envoy is a quite capable person. I don't know him personally, but I know he's working extremely well with the broader Trump foreign policy and national security team. So I think what you're going to see is, I said this kind of a little bit jokingly, but I mean in the second term, Donald Trump really might make us tired of winning, in a number of areas, which has a lot to do with, as you mentioned at the outset, he did learn, I think, from his first time. He's put a good team in place that I think will be more cohesive, at least for a little while, until they get each other's throats on some of these issues. But also that I think this axis of aggressors, which I mentioned at the outset, is profoundly weak at this moment. And President Biden tried to take credit for that bizarrely, earlier this week, when in fact I think that this axis is weak, kind of despite some of the feckless policies of the Biden administration, not because of them.
Let's talk about a few members of Sheriff Trump's posse, since we've been talking about the Middle East and diplomacy. Ultimately, my question to you, gentlemen, if I demote you from Hoover Senior Fellows to United States Senators and further punish you by moving you to Washington, D.C., and make you have to sit through confirmation hearings, question. You're sitting on the Foreign Relations Committee and Marco Rubio is before you. What is your question to Marco Rubio about being Secretary of State? What's the one thing you want to find out for him? HR?
Well, I would like to ask him because he was kind of one of the first people in government to raise the alarm bells about the intentions of the Chinese Communist Party and to question what had been the flawed assumption about that underpins U.S. Policy toward China, which China, having been welcomed into the international community, would play by the rules, and as China prospered, it would liberalize its economy and liberalize its form of governance. Senator Rubio never bought that. But what I would do is I would ask him what his assessment is in connection with our ability to compete effectively with a Chinese Communist Party that is determined to establish exclusionary areas of primacy across the Indo-Pacific region and to create new spheres of influence internationally, such that they can rewrite the rules of international discourse in favor of their status mercantilist economic model and their authoritarian form of government. What is your plan, future Secretary of State, to compete more effectively? I think that would be the question to ask because he's going to have great ideas in this area. And of course, these are ideas that will require support by, the Senate and the Congress broadly. And I think, based on the work that the China Select Committee did in the House, there's a great opportunity, I think, to up our game in terms of the competition with the CCP.
Well, I would ask about the most dangerous place in the world, which is Taiwan. And I'd ask to understand how he thinks about the threat posed by the People's Republic of China to Taiwan's de facto autonomy and democracy. I would also ask about its importance to our economy, given that we now are at a point where 99% of the sophisticated semiconductors used in artificial intelligence come from Taiwan. We are trying to beef up our deterrence. At least that's the strong impression we get from the military side, from Indo-Pacific Command. But are we willing the means to deter China? That would be my question. My sense is that the great problem with the Biden administration's Taiwan policy was that they talked a lot of talk, but they weren't really successful in enhancing Taiwan's capability or our capability to deter China. And I think it's important to understand what the incoming Secretary of State thinks about that issue, because in my view, it's the most dangerous threat to global peace that the world now faces. And it probably will take the Trump administration some time to reestablish deterrence in the Far East.
All right. Now let's shift you to another committee, Senate Armed Services. And had you been part of yesterday's confirmation hearing for Defense Secretary-designate Pete Hegseth, I found this just to be a travesty of a hearing in this regard. It just, instead of a conversation about America's military preparedness, the fiscal crunch facing the Pentagon, which Neil has talked about in terms of the ability to pay for a military versus paying off debt, we were just saddled with a lot of talk about this nominee's sex life, his drinking habits, and so forth. HR, if you were sitting on that committee, what question would you pose Pete Hegseth? Because I'm fascinated by this because I don't think there's been a more complicated time in the history of our country to be a defense secretary.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of an easy one to come up with is what are your top 3 priorities to improve the combat effectiveness, combat readiness, the overall capacity of in our Department of Defense and the Joint Force. What would your top 3 priorities be? And I'd be looking to hear something like, addressing the bow wave of deferred modernization and doing so with an eye toward reforming, how we buy stuff, in the Department of Defense and defense procurement. The second, and he talked about this considerably, would be on how to preserve the warrior ethos, and to ensure that our force has the mentality that's necessary, the kind of cohesion, and the ethos necessary to fight and win in war. And I would like to hear more about what his thoughts are on the capacity of the force, right? And what the assumptions are that should underpin kind of the force sizing, the force structure. Other issues to talk about might be his vision of future warfare and whether or not he believes the U.S. military is prepared to fight and win. And given the way that we see the character of warfare kind of evolving. So yeah, I mean, you want to hear those kind of substantive questions because they're critical to the Senate's role, right, of advice and consent. To make sure that we have the best qualified people in these critical positions.
Now, at one point, HR, he was cornered by Kristen Gillibrand, the senator from New York, about the issue of women in the infantry. And what Gillibrand asked him was whether or not there was a quota on women in that.
Commanders meet quotas to have a certain number of female infantry officers or infantry enlisted, and that disparages those women
Commanders
who are
do
incredibly
not have to
capable
meet
of meeting
quotas
that
for the infantry.
standard.
Is there a quota in the military, HR?
Well, I don't know. I'm not connected with the day to day, but there are standards, and those standards have to be enforced. I was the commander of Fort Moore, Georgia, what used to be before Benning, Georgia, during the period of time in which women were being integrated into combat arms. Now, one of the things I just would like to clarify is there have been some statements about like disagreeing with women being in combat. Hey, women have been in combat for a long, long time. And when I was a commander of an air cavalry squadron, guess who the forward most cavalry scouts were? Kiowa Warrior Scout pilots, right? Who were in front of everybody. And you could argue in the most dangerous position on the battlefield. Who's in the most dangerous position? Is it an infantry soldier in the squad or a tank crewman? Or is it a truck driver sitting in front of 2,500 gallons of JP8 fuel on a contested highway outside of Baghdad? So when we lost Corporal Jeffrey Williams, a fantastic soldier who was the medic on our little platoon that formed my security detail, I asked for volunteers on who would replace him. The first hand that went up from our headquarters medical troop was a female soldier who carried her aid bag, carried her ammunition, her weapon in body armor in 120-degree heat in urban combat, right? So I think it's really important to clarify women are in combat. There is a question of standards, right? What are the standards for close combat formations and units that have a very considerable physical burden associated with duty in those units? And these are typically the formations whose mission it is to close with and destroy the enemy in close combat. Those standards should be non-negotiable because they're based on what you really have to do in battle, what you have to carry on your back, what you have to be able to how you have to perform as part of a unit. So yeah, I mean that should have been the discussion is what should the standards be in close combat units? How are you going to assess the degree to which those standards are being enforced? And I don't know if they're being enforced. And I'm not leading Army units the way that like I used to.
Okay. Neil, I want your thoughts on somebody who will not face a confirmation hearing, and that is Elon Musk. You of the three of us have the best read on Elon. Two questions for you, my friend. First of all, do you think he can swim in his lane? Can he stay focused on Doge suitably? Or is Elon too distracted? And that leads to my question, what is he doing mucking around in British politics?
Well, it's certainly the case that Elon can multitask like no one on this planet. After all, think of all the different companies that he is somehow managing to run at the same time. So I don't think we should just apply normal standards here and assume that if he's using X to attack Keir Starmer, he's not thinking about Doge, the Department of Government Efficiency that he's supposed to be setting up. I would say that Elon's interest in British politics is part of what I call the global vibe shift. And it's a signal to the world that this administration is watching. It's watching to see whether their allies as well as adversaries are sincere in tackling some of the problems that we all collectively face. And I think it's pretty clear that what went on in Britain, and I'm speaking from that country tonight, over not just years but decades, was an indefensible covering up or hushing up of a protracted succession of hideous crimes that are not accurately described with the phrase grooming gangs. What was actually going on were gang rapes of minors. So pedophile rape gangs would be a better description. And the fact that some unknown proportion of these crimes were carried out by people of Pakistani heritage in multiple cities is one of the truly outrageous stories of contemporary British history. If it takes Elon Musk to force a public discussion and perhaps also a public inquiry into that scandal, then that's a sad reflection on the state of health of the British media and the British political class. Does this mean that Elon's not simultaneously running SpaceX and Tesla and the Department of Government Efficiency? No, the man is all but superhuman. And I don't think for a minute that Doge is going to be a dog. I think Doge is going to be a very important part of 2025. Remember, it's a 2-year enterprise to try to make a meaningful impact on waste in the government, which is a big part of the problem of our deficit and our debt and our chronically inefficient federal bureaucracy with its who knows how many agencies. I tried to find out today how many federal agencies there are. The answer is around 430. Nobody's quite sure exactly. Tells you all you need to know, doesn't it? So
It reminds me of one of my favorite Monty Python skits was the Ministry of Silly Walks. Do you remember that one?
There probably is a Federal Bureau of Silly Walks somewhere in the outskirts of Washington, D.C. I think
People were applying for grants, well, actually only one of your legs is silly. Well, that's why I need the grant,
What would you do with the federal government? I was dropping off a letter at the post office the other day, and I looked over at the post office, thought to myself, why do we still have a United States Postal Service in this day and age? It's, doing the U.S. mail is kind of like walking around with the Sony Walkman. Right?
Oh, I disagree with that though, Bill. I mean, I still we have these great Hoover stationery that we use. I mean, I like sending notes to people. Don't you like getting mail, don't you, Bill? I mean, you know.
I wrote a letter only today, but it's true to say that the relative importance of U.S. Postal Service is declining in our extraordinarily technologically transformed world. Now, here's the thing that Elon and Vivek Ramaswamy, who of course will also be on the Doge portfolio, understand very well, namely that the last part of our economy to be transformed by information technology will be the government. And it's got to happen. And until it does happen, we're going to have this chronic fiscal imbalance because the government is an analog entity. It is running at best with legacy software, in some cases not even with software. And if they can make a start on bringing the new age, the 21st century, to the federal government, it will translate, I believe, into meaningful savings. It's, by the way, fashionable to say, oh, this is all impossible. They won't be able to achieve anything. It's been tried before. That's how Washington talks, right, HR? It's like,
Yeah.
we've seen
Hey,
this.
Neil, I know you're in contact with some of the members of this team as they're coming together. You might suggest to them that they take a look at what Japan has been doing for quite a number of years. They have a department that's focused on government efficiency, digitization. And I think this is an area where we can learn a lot from what Japan has tried and what succeeded, what's failed, and I think there's an opportunity there.
And Estonia and Taiwan.
Oh yeah, the digital state thing with digital citizenship in Estonia, absolutely, yeah.
And they're like decades ahead of the US government. So I think this is a really important assignment that Elon's given himself and Vivek. And I think we should be rooting for them. And I think let's just remember what is Peter Thiel's first law: never bet against Elon.
Well put. Okay, I'm going to go see what Estonia and Japan do on their mail service. And for the record, I'm not anti-mail. It's just a question of, is the government doing something the private sector could do better and quicker? So,
I'm going to write you a note today, Bill, to tell you how much I appreciate you, man.
thank you, Wade.
And when you get that in the mail, you're going to feel good. You're going to get a warm feeling. I'm telling you.
So years ago, this journalist Selena Zito said something incredibly trenchant, I think, about the Trump experience. And she said words to the effect that when looking at Donald Trump, you have to understand the following, that his followers take him seriously, but not literally, whereas his detractors take him literally, but not seriously. And this takes me to MAGA, as I call it, which is make a Greenland acquisition. Trump has talked a lot about the world beyond America's shores since he was elected. He has talked about America picking up Greenland. He has talked about Canada becoming a 51st state. He has talked about taking back the Panama Canal. He's talked about the Gulf of Mexico becoming the Gulf of America. So, gentlemen, the Selena Zito question, do we take him seriously? Do we take him literally?
Hey, I think you take him seriously, and he thinks out loud. I write about a lot about this in the book. I tell the story, one day he said, he goes, General, why don't we just bomb them? I'm like, oh, well, who should we bomb, Mr. President? Who do you have in mind? And he would say, he said, the labs in Mexico, and people were after the meeting, we huddled outside of the Oval Office, and some of the people in there, had only rarely interacted with the president. I think there were maybe a couple people who were there for the first time interacting with the president, and they were kind of apoplectic of like, oh my gosh, we're gonna bomb Mexico. I'm like, no, guy. I mean, what he's saying to us is that 90,000 people die every year. 90,000 of our fellow Americans die every year from fentanyl poisoning. And what we're doing isn't working. So what he's telling us to do is to bring him options.
Right.
On Greenland, Greenland, Arctic security is a big deal, right? Maybe we're not doing enough on Arctic security. That's what he's saying, or maybe is Panama giving us a good deal on the canal? I don't know. I mean, but it is a concern of growing Chinese influence, not only in Panama on both sides of the canal where Chinese companies own a lot of the infrastructure, but in the Western Hemisphere broadly. So let's do something about it. So that's what he's saying in a lot of these ideas, or he's a conversational learner. He thinks out loud, right? And so if you're around him, multiple times a day, I mean, you kind of understand that. But I think people, who are only exposed to him sporadically, which is really not that many people anymore, right? As he comes into his second term, I think they should take him seriously, but not always literally, because he does think out loud. He says that what many people, maybe most people, would regard as outlandish things, but those outlandish things that he says are typically conversation starters about a significant issue.
Well, Neil, this ties to something you like to talk about, which is empire versus republic.
Well, that was last year's leitmotif. I always like to start the year with some kind of organizing idea. And this time last year, I remember saying it on this show, the choice we face is between empire and republic. I was being semi-serious because at that time, you may have forgotten this, but back then, part of the Biden campaign was going to be that Donald Trump was this terrible threat to democracy, and that was why you should vote for Joe Biden. Well, here we are. That didn't play out the way they intended. I think the question can be focused now because President Trump revealed during the campaign that he owes some debt to William McKinley, late 19th century president, whom he associates with tariffs. McKinley certainly was a tariff man, but McKinley was also an empire kind of guy because out of the Spanish-American War, the McKinley presidency acquired quite a lot of real estate. It acquired Guam, it acquired the Philippines temporarily, it had Puerto Rico and an option on Cuba. That president also picked up Hawaii along the way. So when President Trump says, hey, how about Canada as a 51st state, or let's rename the Gulf of Mexico, and hey, Greenland, let's have that, he's just being McKinley. And that's why the whole idea that Donald Trump was an isolationist was always so wide of the mark that it was in the opposite direction of the target. So the McKinley element to Trump is interesting to me, that you've got to know when you're trying to decide, am I taking him literally and or seriously, you got to know when Trump is joking. Because sometimes Trump isn't intending to be taken seriously, and I think Canada is that. The whole thing with Justin Trudeau was a massive trolling operation that Trudeau walked right into. And it ended Trudeau's premiership. But I think it was all just a joke. I mean, Trump was obviously making fun of Trudeau when he said, hey, you should be the 51st state and you can be governor. That's a Trump joke. Even if it does have consequences for Trudeau, who should probably not have rushed to Mar-a-Lago the way he did. Greenland is Trump being serious, because there's a serious issue, as HR has rightly said. We're actually lucky to have amongst our fellowship Ike Fryman, who's one of the world's leading experts on this subject, wrote his doctorate on Greenland. And I can remember when he suggested that as a doctoral thesis, scratching my head a little, but of course he was onto something. It's a long-standing problem of North Atlantic security, Greenland. And the status quo is no longer stable if the inhabitants are considering either independence or leaning to China. And so Trump is absolutely right that we have to address this issue because we certainly can't have Greenland becoming part of the Belt and Road Initiative or whatever it is that the Chinese might have in mind. So we got to know, when is he being serious? And when
The
is he...
Senate's introducing a bill, Neil, to authorize the president to negotiate on Greenland. And we should mention there are 58,000 residents in Greenland. It's so in terms of scale, right? I mean, there's something could be feasible there, right? In terms of a deal, right? You could make you make the deal look pretty attractive to 58,000 Greenlanders, I think.
So I think this is a case where one needs to take him both literally and seriously, and understand that what was determined after World War II and the relationship between Denmark and Greenland that exists today is not set in stone. It's not something that was preordained at the creation. And it would be surprising in a world where the tectonic plates are shifting a lot if the United States simply sat passively and let others move the plates.
All right, a sign of the times is that we've spent a lot of time on this podcast talking about Donald Trump, and we haven't talked about Joe Biden, who, by the way, is on TV tonight giving a national address. His timing is excellent. He gets to brag now about the hostage release. I assume it'll be in that speech. I'll leave it to your fellow historians to discuss the Biden legacy. Let's do one question on Biden, and that's this. Where did it go wrong? I could point you to the disastrous debate. I could point you to the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. I could point you to the meeting of historians who came into the White House and said, you can be the next FDR, LBJ if you want to be. But you guys, where do you think Biden went off track?
It went off track right at the start when they told him you can be a transformative president. And the way you can be a transformative president is with a whole bunch of big spending legislation. Think Roosevelt, think LBJ. And he went straight into that at a time when, in fact, the federal government should have been reining in spending because the pandemic was clearly going to come to an end. The vaccines worked. They made a huge mistake in throwing money around in 2021. And that led to the inflation the following year that saw consumer price inflation up at 9%. That's why they lost the election more than any other thing. The second reason you already mentioned, Bill, they bungled Afghanistan. They bungled the withdrawal from Afghanistan, alienating allies, but worst of all, leaving the people of Afghanistan at the mercy of the Taliban. And that set a signal to all the authoritarians, this is a weak presidency. We can have some fun here. So I think it all went wrong in year one. And I'm proud of the fact that I pointed that out at the time when, after 100 days, I was asked, how should we think about the Biden presidency? I said, forget transformative. This is going to be a lot like the Carter presidency. It'll be a one-term presidency, and it's going to be notable for inflation and for geopolitical weakness.
Yeah, HR, if you look at Biden's polling over the 4 years, you get to Afghanistan, and once Afghanistan occurs, his polls go south, and they never come back.
Yeah, I'll tell you, I think I agree with everything Neil said. I think also you could add to that that the administration kind of resurrected, the philosophy of the Obama administration in that it was a performative administration rather than a formative one, and everything about them is messaging. They message everything, and it's all about the story that they can tell about whatever the issue is, rather than the results they can deliver or how they can compete effectively with aggressors and rivals and so forth. It's how to manage the relationship, how to tell a good story about the relationship, and I think that has really underpinned so much of their foreign policy, and they just didn't take seriously that there are hostile states who have aspirations that go far beyond anything that's in reaction to us, and this is how you get kind of the mantra of management of these relationships and sort of the escalation management or the effort to always de-escalate, rather than to compete effectively. And that was read as weakness by our aggressors. And I think, as Neil said, that led directly to the disaster in Afghanistan. It left a trail, from Afghanistan to the massive reinvasion of Ukraine in February of 2022, to the horrific Hamas attacks on Israel, and the activation of Iran's ring of fire against Israel. And I think it also led to a more aggressive stance by the Chinese Communist Party. So I mean, I think one of it was why we have North Korean troops fighting on European soil, right? I mean, I think this is all based on this perception of weakness, and an administration that was focused on its performance, what it said from various podiums, rather than what it did to advance American security and American prosperity.
Very quick exit question. Donald Trump takes office at noon on January 20th, East Coast time. Tell me the one thing that you two are looking for in terms of a measure of Trump being successful.
I think the economy is the thing that's hardest for this incoming administration, because they're inheriting an economy that they overheated with fiscal stimulus. They're inheriting an inflation landing that hasn't really yet fully happened. The bond market is looking at the numbers. Deficit 6% of GDP. Debt is way above 100% of GDP, and it's getting nervous. If the bond market continues to be jittery and the 10-year yield continues to be where it is, then I think the stock market's going to be vulnerable, unless just insanely good news keeps on coming in from the AI bros. So I think their biggest challenge is actually on the economic side. And that, of course, was true of Ronald Reagan too, because 81, 82 saw one of the nastiest of post-war recessions. It didn't have a whole lot to do with Reagan. It had a lot to do with Paul Volcker trying to end the inflation of the 1970s. In the same way, if the economy turns ugly in the next year, it won't really have much, I think, to do with Trump, but he'll be blamed. And people will say, oh, well, you talked about tariffs and you did this and you did that and you spooked the markets. I think in truth, they're really going to have a tough time riding this economy because of the way it's been run by their predecessors. That's what I'm going to be watching, not what's in the New York Times or the BBC or any of the legacy media. I know what they're going to be writing about. They're going to be saying, "Oh, deportations, terrible, terrible." That's going to be their narrative. But I'm going to be looking very closely at really how the markets respond to all the tough things that this administration is going to have to do. HR?
Hey, I think I'll be just, of course, paying attention to the tone. Remember the first inaugural speech, the tagline became American Carnage, and what I'm hoping to see is, kind of a positive vision, for the future of the country. I think that we do have kind of a crisis of confidence in our country. I hope that President Trump helps us get over that and restores our confidence in our common identity as Americans. And I hope that he sort of sets off on a path that allows him to do a better job than he did in his first term, and certainly a better job than Joe Biden did at getting to the politics of addition, to bring Americans together around a positive agenda for restoring confidence, in who we are, but also confidence in our democratic principles and institutions and processes, and as you said, the confidence in our free market economic system, right, and confidence among maybe younger generations that they're going to have even a better life, than their parents and grandparents. So, tone is going to be a big part of it, I think, and I hope it's positive, and I hope it sets them off on a course toward, getting to this kind of politics of addition.
And I'm watching his chief of staff, Susie Wiles, who is saying all the right things in the transition, how she is going to limit access to the Oval Office. She's not going to let independent operators with their own agendas try to cloud up the president's thinking. If you're not familiar with Washington, a chief of staff is hugely important to a president in terms of being both a traffic cop, but also keeping the president on a steady beat. So let's see if Susie's successful. And with that,
Good luck. Good luck. I mean, I'll tell you, I think that's great, but the president, he likes to talk to a broad range of people. You can't limit that, right?
Right.
But I think what you can do is you can limit the degree to which people can try to manipulate him, So whenever, certain people went into the Oval Office, I made sure I went in with them because I knew they were bringing with them an element of kind of a foreign policy agenda, or they wanted the president to do a solid for them, internationally. And there's nothing good for the president in that kind of stuff. So I think, it's really important for the chief of staff, the national security advisor, to recognize, as you're alluding to, Phil. I mean, these are two people in the White House who have the president really as their main client, right? And national advisor really the only client, and it's really important to make sure that the president is not sort of manipulated, and of course this happens with every president, and they'll try the people who push his buttons, they do it with flattery, they do it with hey, this will make you look weak. This will alienate your base, your most loyal supporters. They're not going to like you anymore if you do this. I think what you really need to do is, as a chief of staff, is make sure the president gets best advice and hears from a broad range of people, but always gets multiple options because the president deserves multiple options. The
Right.
president's the person who got elected, So don't try to shine one course of action up and get everybody to try to get Donald Trump to approve it. Give him a range of actions. Help him understand how this fits into his overall agenda. And I think that when that happens with Donald Trump, he makes good decisions. If you try to just give him that one option, or if you try to manipulate him into certain decisions, it's going to backfire.
Okay, on to the lightning round. So 4 years ago, our friend Niall Ferguson published a book called Doom, The Politics of Catastrophe. And if you look at that book and you look at the photo on the jacket of that book, it looks like, Neil, you're playing golf in Los Angeles right now, not to diminish what the good people at that city are going through. If you haven't seen the book, read the book yet, by means do get it and look at that photo. It shows a fire about to consume a golf course, making for the trickiest of par fours, we would agree. Neil, as you watch what's going on in Los Angeles, it strikes me as really something straight out of your book, in that LA's problems are one part nature. You can't control 100-mile-an-hour Santa Ana winds, but it's also one part man in terms of bad government policy. So could you put LA's plight in the doom narrative?
Well, it fits right in because the central argument of that book was there's no such thing as a purely natural catastrophe in almost every case. And you can go all the way back to ancient volcanic eruptions. There's some element of human agency involved. After all, nobody made you build a city at the foot of a volcano, Vesuvius, for example. And I think that the case of the fires of Los Angeles, truly terrible events that have destroyed the homes of many thousands of people and cost lives, dozens of lives, need to be understood in this way. The debate that's going on right now, as far as I can see, is between those who say, oh, it's a purely natural event. How can anybody possibly blame the local authorities or the state authorities? And those on the other side who say it's entirely the fault of misguided climate policies. And the reality is, as with nearly all disasters, all great fires, great floods, all the great disasters that my book describes, it's this point at which nature intersects with bad decisions. There have been a lot of bad decisions taken in California over some decades since California became a one-party state, and environmental preoccupations took over from, say, policies of controlled burning in areas vulnerable to fire, when we stopped investing in our water infrastructure. These problems are so well established that I remember writing a column about wildfires in California as a political problem at least 4 years ago, when we had a spate of fires in Northern California. So you can't exonerate the state government or the city government by simply saying, gee, the wind was really strong and fires happened here. There has been a pattern of misgovernment in California and in the major cities of California. And I can only hope that this calamity in the state's biggest city finally persuades people that there's something rotten at the heart of the California Democratic Party, and there needs to be real opposition to it within the state if the state is to be properly managed again. And it has not been properly managed, I'm sorry to say, for decades.
Right. So HR Institute, the podcaster, columnist Hugh Hewitt has called this California's Chernobyl in this regard. In the 1980s, Chernobyl occurs in the Soviet Union, and the government cannot cover up the fact that this has occurred. And the people suddenly realize, my God, this is Soviet-style management. And Hugh contends that the fires have exploded this in California. But what you see going on in California right now, HR, is a leadership crisis, plain and simple. The governor does not have control of the situation. There's no confidence in the mayor. At any chance, they will throw somebody else under the bus and not say something as simple as, this is my fault, I screwed up. Does this speak to a larger leadership crisis in this country?
Hey, Bill, I think you're exactly right. It's a crisis of leadership, and I'd like to just ask you the question. I mean, you're an expert on California politics. I recommend our readers go to your column. They listen to your podcast. It's fantastic. And everything I know about California politics, I kind of learned from you, Bill. So I'm going to ask you, is this a moment of reckoning? Are people finally going to elect people like Rick Caruso, for example, in LA, instead of more of the same, the next Karen Bass that comes along? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I hope so. I really hope so. I mean, my whole family's here. My children, my grandchildren are all in California, and it's a beautiful place. It's a wonderful place to live. And as you've exposed so many times in so many different ways, it's so poorly led. So, Bill, what are the prospects? Are things going to get better?
The door is wide open to someone like Rick Caruso to run in a recall election. Caruso, for those not aware, is a developer extraordinaire in Los Angeles. He ran for mayor in 2022, and he lost to Karen Bass, the current mayor. He could run in a recall. He could probably win in a recall. But here's what I've been thinking about this. It's not going to bring Ronald Reagan overnight. The state is still 2-1 Democratic in terms of party registration. But I think what we're seeing here is now the door is wide open to an ideas conversation in California. Without boring you the nuances of our politics here, we had a ballot initiative last fall, Proposition 36, and this was undoing a previous ballot initiative which had watered down punishment for shoplifting in California. If you got caught with less than $900 of goods, misdemeanor penalty, the cops don't really want to prosecute you, you get turned back on the street. Revolving door of justice leads to stores getting constantly looted, stores eventually shut down, and Neil, that's why you get San Francisco in a doom loop, to use doom once again. We're going to sell that book today as best we can.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
What the point I'm making here is that Prop 36 not only passed last fall, an anti-crime measure, it got almost 70% of the statewide vote. That is an incredibly rarefied era for a California ballot initiative. It passed in every county in California, including Marin County, which hates these sorts of measures because Californians have fed up. If you look north to San Francisco, which was somewhat gloating while Los Angeles is suffering because why? Blue skies, no earthquakes. One, there was a reminder that no part of California is safe. San Francisco actually had an earthquake last Friday. It was in the same spot as the 1906 earthquake. That would make me nervous if I lived there. But San Francisco inaugurated a new mayor last week. His name is Daniel Lurie. He's an heir to the Levi Strauss fortune. And what's notable about Mr. Lurie is that he is not a product of San Francisco politics. This is the first time they've chosen a non-political mayor since the Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower era. So voters in San Francisco are fed up, and they're looking for something different. So I would argue that if you really want to affect change in California, I would not spend $20 million trying to elect a Republican because he has the wrong letter at the end of his name. I would get involved in the initiative process and start pushing ideas and forcing the status quo in California to defend them. But let me throw this back to you guys. You both are, well, Neil's a former California, recovering Californian, I guess we would call it. HR is still a Californian. My question to the two of you is, would you advise somebody to move to California? This is a beautiful land. Nature is spectacular. There is opportunity if you are very intelligent and very innovative. On the other hand, housing is impossibly expensive. Good luck getting gasoline at a cheap price. If I took you guys to my favorite diner in Palo Alto, I'd treat you to a $23 omelet. Why would anybody want to live here?
Hey, I mean, it's how about the scenery, the climate? How about just the look outside my window right now, Bill. I mean, looking at the Santa Cruz Mountains, or looking down the South Bay. I mean, so I think it is a great place to be, and it is a really creative place. I've really I didn't really even understand it how this innovation ecosystem worked until I came back to California after having been a National Security Affairs Fellow here at Hoover from 2002 to 2003. And you have the universities who are connected to so much of the capital that's available here, and the venture firms who are connected to the engineers that these universities produce, right? And the ideas that are generated here. So it's an exciting place to be, and I think it is a real hub for innovation across the country, and a real strength of the United States. I think there has been, and Michael Anton, who's going back into the Trump administration, is a great guy, and he was our communications director and National Security Council staff. He wrote a really acerbic but extraordinarily witty essay about the history of Silicon Valley. and about the turn it took away from its roots, which was really the defense industry, in the post World War II period in particular, and World War II period. And so I think that it's coming back. I mean, I think what I see here, and people would tell me, "Oh man, you're out there in California. Isn't that like a environment of like self-loathing?" No, I mean there are so many patriotic people here who believe in our country, who understand that we're in consequential competitions internationally. So I think because of the wholesale politics here, and what you described as the Democratic Party's exclusive grip on power and a certain ideology that has been prevalent here for a long time, there's kind of a misunderstanding of the many Californias that exist, and so many of the people here who are determined to help advance our interests and humanity's interests against what we see as, I think, threats to our way of life, manifested by the Chinese Communist Party, for example, or what we see with Russia and the war in Ukraine, or terrorist organizations and their sponsors like Iran. So anyway, I think it's not this California that I know is not what people perceive it to be. From my old hometown, like in Philadelphia, where a lot of my cousins are like, "Man, I can't believe you're in California. What is that like?" I'm like, "Yeah, it's great. It's great."
It is great, and I want to stress to Goodfellows fans that I have not left California for the conventional political or economic reasons. I'm back here for family reasons and flying to California tomorrow and looking forward to it very much. I think HR's right. I think things are finally turning because the progressive wing of the Democratic Party has just made such a huge mess of the two major cities. And after a certain point, even the most liberally inclined, conservative-hating Californian says something's got to change. So I think it is going to change. I think there's also been a big shift in sentiment in Silicon Valley. And let's not forget, maybe this is a good note on which to end, that this election might have turned out very differently if the tech bros, the red-pilled tech bros, Elon Musk, but also my friend Mark Andreessen, Joe Lonsdale, a bunch of people from the tech sector had not decisively shifted their political orientation and backed Donald Trump. That was a very big difference between 2024 and 2016. And a lot of that impetus, which lies behind ideas like Doge, originates in Silicon Valley. So I think Silicon Valley has really shifted. And as Silicon Valley goes, so I think ultimately California goes. It's coming back, and the vibe shift cannot be escaped anywhere in the world, including in Los Angeles, in San Francisco, and let's hope finally in Sacramento.
Hey, and I'll tell you, I love California, but I don't love California enough to be rooting for the Rams this weekend. Just to make that clear.
Hey, Neil, since you mentioned Silicon Valley, I want to splice one more thing before we go, and that is Meta. It's now ditched its fact-checking program. The other day announced it's now doing away with its DEI programs, meaning hiring, training, and suppliers. Neil, what the Zuck is going on?
Well, if you think back, I think it was to 2019, he gave a pretty strong defense of free speech in a lecture that he gave in Washington at that point. And then he was kind of just swamped by the trends that we saw in all the big tech companies. They emanated in some ways from the universities where they hire their young people, from the HR department. And I think Mark Zuckerberg, like other tech leaders who might have been personally libertarian inclined, were just overwhelmed. I don't think it speaks very well of Mark Zuckerberg that he folded, as he clearly did in 2020, 2021, where Meta or Facebook was just as much part of the tech censorship complex as any of the big tech companies. But I'm glad to see that the vibe shift has enabled him to throw off that mask and revert to his 2019 position. I think that's a healthy thing. It does slightly remind me of an old Rothschild joke, which is, what are my principles today with regard to pork bellies? I mean, what are your principles today is a good question to ask the next tech bro you meet.
Good. HR, you have the last word.
Hey, I just think sometimes you have to take people, you have to believe what they say, and I think his message was it seemed to be sincere. Hey, we tried to do this, it didn't work out, we were wrong, and he reversed his position. And so I think that, as Neil said, is positive. I think it does reflect what Neil began to talk about at the beginning of our discussion today, which is the shift in the vibe overall. Which I think is in a positive direction, and so all reasons to be optimistic. And I hope that our incoming president is optimistic in his speech coming up here at the inauguration.
Okay, guys, good conversation. Very efficient conversation. Doge, Department of Goodfellows Efficiency. How's that? On behalf of the Goodfellows, Neil Ferguson, Sir Neil Ferguson, and HR McMaster, our missing Goodfellow, the recovering economist, John Cochran. Get better, John, soon. We miss you. We hope you enjoyed today's show. We'll be back in later this month with a very good guest. I'm not going to tell you who it is. You're going to have to tune to watch, but you're going to like it. Trust me.
But I've got one more Doge.
One more
Department of Go Eagles.
You're going to have to teach Neil to fly eagles twice long at some point. Anyway, folks, thanks again for watching. A very belated happy 2025, and we'll see you soon. Take care. Thanks for watching.
Fly, eagles, fly, on the road to victory.
If you enjoyed this show and are interested in watching more content featuring HR McMaster, watch Battlegrounds, also available at hoover.org.